Hey everyone. Now I know some of us are gripped in Booker fever now that the Booker long list has been announced and we're reading a lot of the titles, but maybe you aren't interested in the Booker Prize or just the titles that have been longlisted don't appeal to you and you're looking for something else to read. So I thought I'd make a video today about other publications, things that are being published in the UK in August, which are coming out that I think sound really interesting and that I'm really tempted to read as well, like, you know, that constant problem of having too much to want to read, but that isn't a bad thing. But I am interested in the Booker Prize and a lot of the titles on the list, like I talked about in my previous video, and I did just get my copy of Washington Black by S.A. Edugyan, which has just been published in the UK, and it's even come wrapped in this official Man Booker Prize 2018 seal, which I might just break now because, ooh, that's satisfying. But this is one of the novels I'm most looking forward to, and the edition is beautiful with this like gleaming gold foil on it. So I hope to read that soon. But four books that, not four books, but talking about books that are being published in the UK this month, there is a novel called Child of Fortune by Yuko Tsushima. Penguin seem on a mission this year to bring this Japanese author into the UK, even though I think she was writing some time ago, but she's just been published a lot in the UK. And I want to talk about this particularly because August is also Women in Translation Month, where lots of people are grouping around getting excited to read translated books that were written by women, and there'll be a readathon at the end of this month organized by Matthew and Jennifer and Kendra. So I am really excited about that too. And this would be a good novel to read in joining along with that. And someone who I've been meaning to read because also published earlier this year was this novel called Territory of Light by the same author. Like I said, Penguin's bringing a lot of her books back. But anyway, this novel, Child of Fortune, follows a year in the life of a woman living in Tokyo, raising her daughter as a single parent, and she's doing this sort of against the wishes of her family, being a single mother. And during the course of that year, she finds out she's pregnant and going to have another child, and the dilemma that raises for her. Sounds really good and is fairly short as well. And then there is the novel People in the Room by Nora Lane. And this is a novel published by And Other Stories, who I've talked about before, who are actually this year on a mission to only publish female authors, and they publish a lot of women in translation, so it's a great press to follow if you're looking for options for Women in Translation Month. And Nora Lane is actually an author who's never been translated into English before. This novel was first published in 1950 in Argentina, and Nora Lane was involved in this sort of movement of writers in the 20s and 30s in Buenos Aires. But she's never really come into English, and she's sort of been characterized as Borges' muse, but has never come into her own right outside of her country as a writer herself. And so now she's being published in English for the first time. And this has an introduction too by Cesar Area, who's a very odd novelist, who's a very prolific novelist. If you've never read him before, he's very weird. He writes very short experimental books. And this novel is about a woman viewing the apartment opposite her, how there are three women in that apartment who she sort of spies on voyeuristically and observes them and starts imagining what their lives might be like, and she starts imagining all these different scenarios that they're living in. So I think it's sort of like a Rear Window type situation, but more of like a thoughtful and reflective novel. And then I have very exciting John Boyne's new novel called A Ladder to the Sky, and I loved his novel The Heart's Invisible Furies that was published last year. So good. And this is another quite chunky novel. It's impressive. He's been quite prolific because Heart's Invisible Furies was really long as well. But this novel is about a man who wants to become a writer, and he has big ambitions, and he befriends an older writer who sort of teaches him some tricks of the trade. And he travels around and he starts collecting all these stories of people in his ambitious way to become a famous writer. And it's about the dangers of taking on other people's stories as your own and the problems he finds in trying to achieve his great ambition. So I'm very curious to read this. Women Talking by Miriam Toews. This is a proof copy, so this is the finished copy. And this novel sounds so fascinating. I've never read Miriam Toews before, but she's like very well respected. I keep meaning to read her, so I feel like she's a writer that I would really enjoy. But this novel, Women Talking, sounds so interesting and really like bracing and scary as well, because it's inspired by the events which happened in Bolivia from 2005 to 2009 in a remote Mennonite community. This is a very conservative Christian community, very isolated conservative Christian community in Bolivia. And there were these incidents where over the course of these years, 100 women were continuously knocked unconscious and raped periodically over this time. And they were told when they woke up that it was the devil punishing them for their sins. But obviously it was these men who were taking advantage of them. And so this novel is sort of inspired by this group of women, this isolated women who were raised in this community and didn't know anything outside of it, and about the conversations that they start having with each other and the steps they take to try to protect one another. So it sounds like a very bracing subject matter, but also really powerful. How Are You Going to Save Yourself by J.M. Holmes. This is a debut author, I think, and this is a novel about four young friends living in a small community in Rhode Island, and it follows sort of the course of their lives and them trying to figure out where they fit into society. And it's about race and class and sex and drugs and family. And there's a quote on the back from James Hanahan, who's a writer I really like, who wrote a novel called God Says No. And he says, J.M. Holmes writes, like someone told him Dennis Johnson and Matt Johnson were brothers. These stories are as ferocious and fearless as those of his heroes. Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller. This is a proof copy, a rather gorgeous proof copy with this gold foil on it. And it's a rather thick historical novel. And this is about a captain in the very early 1800s, an English captain who comes back from fighting in Spain in the Napoleonic Wars unsuccessfully. And it's about his process of trying to find a different life for himself. Sounds like a really immersive historical novel. Perfidious Albion by Sam Byers, and this is an amazing cover, really detailed and really gorgeous. So if you don't know, Perfidious means deceitful or untrustworthy, and Albion is the oldest known name for Great Britain, for the Isles of Great Britain. So it's the combination of that. And it takes place in a sort of dystopian future, or it's a slightly future set, but a realistic dystopian future. So it's described as, I thought this description is so interesting. It comes over like an episode of Black Mirror as scripted by a woke Martin Amis. And so it's in a future where Brexit has happened and it's real, and it's a town called, and it takes place in a town called Edmondsbury. And this sort of quaint little English town thinks that it sort of can't be touched by larger events of the world, but then they start impacting this peaceful town. So it sounds like a sort of version of Britain, which might be scarily real. Cassandra at the Wedding by Dorothy Baker. This novel was first published in 1962, but this is a new edition, and it sounds so good. It's about a woman who returns back to her hometown to attend the wedding of her twin sister, and she has plans to disrupt that wedding. So it sounds like a really good, gripping story. And there's a quote on the back from Carson McCullers, who says, I, whose usual bedtime is 10 o'clock, stayed up all night reading that exquisite Cassandra at the Wedding dazzled by the pyrotechnics of such an artist. I also have Patrick Gale's new novel called Take Nothing With You. And Patrick Gale is a writer, I've been talking with Matthew about this recently. It seems that he's never really made it in the US. He's a very popular author in the UK, but he's just never really seemed to have jumped across the pond. And I know Patrick, and so I asked him about this once before, why he's not really published in America. And he said that US publishers always said that they felt his writing is too English to go down well in America, which just really confuses me because so many English authors get published in the US. And it's not like he uses terminology that Americans would be like, oh, I don't know what that means. So it's strange. But anyway, I'm about halfway through reading this novel now, really enjoying it. And it's about a man, and it sort of starts following him later in life when he's developed cancer, and he's thinking back on his early life and following the course of his life as he develops his interests in being a cellist and also his natural born skills in being a mathematician. And so it's about him finding a relationship later in life when he's going through these difficulties. He's really moving, beautiful writing he has in his books. So I hope he does get known in America because he's very good. All the Hidden Truths by Clare Askew. This is a crime novel, and I don't normally read crime novels, but this is a debut crime novel. And the Booker Prize longlist has taught us we shouldn't limit the genres that we read in. Or maybe we should. Maybe we find that those really aren't the genres for us. But I think it's good every once in a while to give something else a try. And it happens to be a very rainy, miserable day out in London today. So it's the type of day that I just want to stay in and want to read something different, like a crime novel. And also this has bright yellow pages, which is quite different. But the story sounds really interesting. So there's a series of murders which happen in Edinburgh of a man who kills a large group of people. And then the novel follows, but nobody knows why he's done this. And so the novel follows 3 different women as they try to uncover what his motivations were behind all of these killings. And one of them is the mother of one of the victims, one of them is the mother of the perpetrator, and one of them is a female detective trying to sort out what happened. So that sounds like a gripping story. And finally, I want to talk about a novel which isn't actually new. This was first published last year, last October, but I want to talk about it now because it's just been nominated for The Guardian's Not the Booker Prize list. Every year The Guardian does this alternative Booker Prize list where it's all through a public vote where the public leave comments on the Guardian article, picking 2 books that they think should be nominated for this Not the Booker Prize and giving reasons why they think these recently published books are so good. And so it's sort of a public vote and an alternative to the actual Booker Prize. But of course, it raises all of its own problems because in the past, there's some authors or the publisher can try to sway the vote by getting groups of people and rallying groups of people to try to nominate their books. And so it can give a distorted picture of what is the best fiction around. And that's not always the best strategy because I've read some of these books in the past which have been nominated suspectly, which feels like the author has just tried to get their book on there. And the books aren't always that good. And I remember one case where people said that a particular author, I can't remember the author's name or what the book was called, but said that he tried to get his book on the list and everyone read it and everyone hated it. So all he really resulted in having, he might have got a few more sales, but the result was just there was a load of people really talking down about his novel. And I tried reading it, I read about half of it, and it was really awful. And so, yeah, that was a bad experience. But this novel sounds really good, and it's published by a small independent press called Dead Ink Books. And it's a dystopian novel called Sealed by Naomi Booth. And it's about a couple who, there's an epidemic happening, and they try to escape this epidemic by going to live in a very remote location It's a man and a woman, and the woman is heavily pregnant. And so they go live in this isolated place, but then they find that that encourages its own dangers and problems in the small community that they find there. And there's all sorts of different conflicts that they come up against. And so I think that sounds really good. I like the cover of this sort of like remote location of this house that they go live in. So I think that sounds really interesting. And different kind of, if you want an alternative to the mainstream Booker Prize, there is the Not the Booker Prize, which has a number of books on it, which I think sound quite interesting. So those are all the books that I want to talk about. Let me know which you think sound interesting, what other new books you're reading, or if you are in fact reading books longlisted for the Booker Prize. And I will speak to you again soon. Happy reading, everyone!